clear and concise. This is the Jason Bermas Show on today's News Talk, TNT.
Derek Broze is our guest. You can find his work over at The Last American Vagabond and, of course, at theconsciousresistance.com. Now, Derek, since I saw it come out, I think 4 days ago, I have been talking about this Peter Theil, Joe Rogan episode. And one of the big reasons is, you know, unless you're kind of in our realm or in the tech field or in the defense industry, you may not even know who Peter Thiel is. Now, I certainly thought the conversation was going to go in a very different direction. And I got to be honest, I was ignorant to the fact that there seemed to be a relationship between Thiel and Joe Rogan prior to this interview. They actually talk about hanging out and talking about some of the very things they end up talking about on this, which, although it varies widely, there is a huge section, not only on the deep state, MKUltra, but Epstein in particular. You know, I'm gonna tease that there's just like a WTF moment where I just had to put my hand in my head, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what were your thoughts when you were listening to this thing?
So I just spent the morning watching. I haven't got all the way through the final hour, but I got through the majority of it. And I mean, honestly, I'll say the first 30 minutes aren't worth anybody's time. Peter Thiel is kind of like, that's just the way he communicates, I guess. And we saw that in that clip a couple of weeks ago when he was asked about Israel that I think we discussed. But as you mentioned, there is a section where they start getting into some more serious topics. For one, you also mentioned that they clearly know each other. They've talked about hanging out in LA. Obviously, Joe used to spend a lot of time in California, comedy clubs, and he knows a lot of people out there. And through his podcast, he's gotten more connected as well. And so to me, it's sort of not to say that they can't have a friendly conversation just because they're friends, but I think that's important to understand, because it's not like Joe just met this guy for the first time and doesn't know anything about his history, which to me, like, for example, the section I was at right now was him asking him about Bill Gates and asking him about Epstein. And he keeps posing these questions as if Peter Thiel is not a part of the same sort of cabal that he's asking about. He's like, imagine having that much money and imagine that much power and influence. And he's just asking this to Thiel with this, to me, the elephant in the room of like, okay, Palantir, CIA contracts, you know, this guy's PayPal mafia, of course, the whole, you know, we can get into the whole thing about him and Hulk Hogan and all this stuff. Like there's so much there that, and then of course the Bilderberg steering committee member thing that maybe Joe Rogan doesn't know about. I don't know. But to me, there was this big elephant in the room. Like while they're getting into some serious topic, there's never really a moment where he says, and what's your role in this, Mr. Thiel? What role do you play? And aren't you friends with some of these various characters in this story? I found that to be probably the most troubling aspect, but still there were some other interesting things we can get into.
No, let's talk about that aspect, because that was the thing that, you know, and I'm still going to tease this moment because that's at the crescendo of the moment, because I'm watching this and like you said, you know, he's talking about Gates. He's talking about the Mossad, and he talks about going deep into the Epstein thing. You know, all these different things. They talk about Snowden and Assange and WikiLeaks and, you know, that deal as well. All things, and like you said, some of the other things you didn't hit on. You mentioned Palantir, but Palantir, Lavender, AI, that's all very much in the mix right now when we're talking about the military-industrial complex. But in particular, when talking about Epstein, and then later on and how everything works, because Thiel is very deflective, right? He brings what he likes to call alternate conspiracies that are kind of convenience, right? Like he talks about the fact that Bill Gates, for instance, wanted to get a divorce, wasn't happy, finds Epstein as a shoulder to cry on, probably because he knows that he's involved with all these women, et cetera, that he can cheat on his wife with. And that's where the conspiracy lies. But if you notice, and this is one of those troubling aspects, we know that both Gates and Epstein are into transhumanism and all sorts of different bio-nanotechnology that go along with that transhumanism. Well, it also happens that Thiel is very involved in anti-aging and biological experiments of his own. A lot of people forget about the scandal that he was having offshore tests done on people with herpes, trying to cure herpes with a vaccination. And if you notice, there's also that part on double-blind studies in there, which was an interesting, again, I was fascinated through the whole thing, which is an interesting part of the conversation. Now let's get to the WTF moment. After discussing a crescendo of these issues, from MKUltra to even quote unquote leftist foundations and philanthropy and agenda, the climate agenda, for instance, Joe just kind of casually goes, maybe we'll need somebody like a Whitney Webb just to figure it all out for us. Now, I don't think I've ever heard Joe mention Whitney before. I don't think she's done the podcast yet, right? Like, I think I would have known that and remembered it. But the other thing is that, you know this, I've had conversations with Whitney. You've had conversations with Whitney in the public arena about Peter Theil, who she's also written about and talked about extensively. So, right there is, Theil has to be aware of who Whitney Webb is if Joe Rogan is bringing it up. And I wonder if they've had a behind-the-scenes conversation about that. You notice Theil doesn't make any public commentary about Whitney at all, and the conversation just moves on. So I want to get your take on that moment.
Yeah, I actually just heard that not too long ago, listening to it right before our conversation. And yeah, Theil is kind of just silent, and then the conversation changes. And it makes me wonder, of course, we can speculate. That's all we have at this moment. We're not inside Joe's head. I think you're correct. That was the first time Whitney's probably been mentioned, if maybe mentioned in passing by a guest or something like that, but she's never been on the podcast yet. I feel like that's probably inevitable if Joe truly wants to, is who he portrays himself as, somebody who wants to show these wide range of perspectives, but maybe not. Maybe he doesn't want to upset his rich friends like Peter Thiel. But I found it interesting, nevertheless, that he even mentioned her. And he specifically said something like, we're going to need a character, like someone like a Whitney Webb-like character to dig in and really one day find out the truth of what was happening with Epstein or this and that, and just kind of leaves that hanging there. And I think that it could have either been, like, as we said, they're friends. They probably talked before the conversation was hit record. Maybe he even mentioned Whitney. It's like, hey, do you mind if I bring up Whitney Webb's work? Or maybe they had no discussion about it. Joe was maybe testing the waters, because if Joe knows her work, then he knows it enough, and he brought it up in the context of Epstein, then he would know it enough to know she wrote a book about Epstein. More than likely, I don't know if he follows her on Twitter or something like that, but he's probably seen some interviews of her, and he's probably heard her talk about Peter Thiel. So it could have been almost like a sort of jab towards Theil that, is kind of in a friendly way by bringing her up and see how he respond. Or, it could have been the other way, that they're both kind of maybe laughing in our faces as they mentioned Whitney Webb, and Joe is sitting here with this man that we know has all these shady connections, that none of which get explored in the conversation.
So yeah, let's talk about those type of connections just really quickly, because listen, one of the things that Rogan has recently discussed on his podcast, which you're not hearing in the mainstream in that manner, is lavender and AI in warfare, right? I don't know if you've seen the headlines, but right now, Alex Karp is out there basically saying it is inevitable that we're going to be fighting this two-front war against China and Russia. That's terrifying. And AI is going to be a big part of that. One of the places that you're finding him is not only at these military-industrial complex conferences, but also things like CES. And again, that's that crossover of the military-industrial complex with mainstream security and software, which Palantir is. It's not just, for the Lockheeds and the Raytheons of the world. They want this thing everywhere.
No, absolutely. And I hadn't seen the news about Alex Karp saying that, but that's important because he's also a member of the steering committee, member of the Bilderberg Group as well, and of course connected to Thiel through Palantir. Not bringing that topic up.
Handpicked.
Exactly.
Handpicked. Like, if you listen, I suggest everybody go watch it. It may be boring for you, and yes, Alex Karp is in a pink sweater a la Gates, but go watch him at the World Economic Forum and what he says. And basically, Thiel came up to him like on campus, like, hey, buddy, you want to blah, blah, blah? We're doing this thing. I mean, handpicked. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, though, that's one of the areas that didn't get explored. One thing I will mention is if you go to the YouTube, Joe Rogan's YouTube channel, which is, of course, where the podcast is hosted, or at least one of the places, I was happy to see that the vast majority of the comments were definitely talking crap and saying, either mentioning Whitney or saying Joe, you're literally sitting across the table from a deep state character, a deep state actor. Why is this not being brought up? So it was really cool to see that at least some of his audience at this point has heard the news, is aware, is informed enough to know that there's much deeper areas we could go into with Peter Thiel instead of talking to him about apes and things like that for however long. The other thing I want to mention, I'm actually going to be putting out a clip of this section of the interview after we finish our discussion here. Thiel does mention the Club of Rome about 45 minutes in. And for those who understand the importance of the Club of Rome, now he's not kind of fanboying over them necessarily, but it's during the climate change discussion that you mentioned, Jason, and he says something to the effect like, well, you can steal, let's see if we can steel man the argument, in favor of the climate narrative. And then he starts talking about, well, there was this group in 1975, they put out this thing, Limits to Growth, and he kind of plays it up a little bit and says, well, maybe that's what they're thinking. Maybe they just have this Malthusian sort of thought process about resources and that we can't, everybody can't have an American standard of living, so we need to, start controlling things and, bringing our standard of living down. I wouldn't say that's a full-throated endorsement of the Club of Rome, but I did find it interesting that he has to know the controversy surrounding the Club of Rome, talking about reducing population and things like that. He brings it up in his words to steel man the climate change narrative. So he's saying like, okay, let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Maybe this is what it's all about. But he definitely doesn't say that group is wrong, that group is crazy, I have nothing to do with them, and I have no way support their efforts.
And by the way, let me just say this. When you're talking about narratives that he kind of projects in less of a libertarian pose, they also talk about aliens and space travel, etc., and warp speed. And he basically says if warp speed ever actually exists, then you have warp weapons. And because of those warp weapons, you need a fully totalitarian, top-down, dictated society, and basically a full-on mind meld for that society. So that also was extremely alarming to me. Now, he wasn't necessarily proposing it. He was actually, just warning against it. But at the same time, you have to wonder how much technology is out there and whether or not warp speed, hypersonic speed, if there is much of a valid difference. One of the other really interesting aspects is they get into not only the Kennedy assassination, which they talk about, but they also talk about the assassination attempt on Trump. And once again, although many people, again, that aren't in the political arena or paying attention don't understand, Theil was tapped by Trump, handpicked to be his technology secretary during his administration. And those connections to not only Trump, but Vance are never discussed, although the assassination attempt is, and even the idea of Crooks being some type of a later MKUltra program type cutout.
Yeah, they definitely brought that up, and it was interesting. Like you said, Thiel seems to offer his alternative conspiracy theories multiple times when Rogan's like, no, but didn't you know about this? Like, for example, in the JFK thing, Rogan's like, well, did you know so-and-so from this organization, this person died in this way? Like, it doesn't seem like Thiel's super educated, or at least that's the card that he's playing there. But the other thing is when they get into the MKUltra discussion, I found it really just interesting. That moment when Joe Rogan asked Peter Thiel directly, do you think things like MKUltra are still continuing to this day? That was the longest silence that Thiel had other than his umming throughout the whole interview. He just sat there silent for a good 10 seconds or so. And maybe he's really giving it some deep thought. I don't know. I found that curious, just sort of the way he paused and didn't say anything immediately. And I also think that the other aspect is he was totally downplaying the role of Israel numerous times and saying like, oh, no, Israel doesn't, people with Israel don't get away from things. There's other examples. And Joe's like, no, I don't know. I didn't see an example. He kind of like tries to counter his.
Well, let me jump in there because
times he downplayed Israel.
Well, he also brings up Jonathan Pollard, who basically recently, within the last several years, was released and was supposed to be serving a life sentence because he was an American naval soldier that was giving up nuclear secrets, caught. And, they had lobbied for Pollard for a very, very long time. It was during the Trump administration, right, that they let him out. It wasn't the Biden administration. I could be incorrect on that. And I would agree. The Mossad is specifically brought up, and he moves away from it. and he always brings up these alternative conspiracy theories. But let me jump in on the MKUltra part. And he says why he doesn't believe that there could be modern day programs like that that were shored up underground. He brings up specifically Guantanamo Bay and the torture and the activities that went on there. But again, and he says now they've been hyper regulated. I don't know that. What I do know is that he talked about that. He's DEI and all these things that have made it soft. I don't know that. I do know that when they were running the type of torture experiments at Guantanamo Bay, they were very much of the same type of de-patterning that you saw via MKUltra at universities like McGill, where you had sensory deprivation, you had the same things being played over and over and over and over again, like the Barney thing, I love you, you love me. Remember, most of the people don't even know, our language. It's pure on torture. So that is a recent example. Just because we're talking about 20 years ago, that's not the 60s and the 70s when they were doing these programs. In fact, they even talk about chaos and the possible Charlie Manson connection and how he says that was downplayed. He thinks, again, even the stuff with Epstein, the kid stuff was upplayed and all the other stuff was downplayed. So we got about a minute left. I realize this is a really, where do you, put this interview? But I want to get your final thoughts and kind of a response to what I just said.
Yeah, no, I think Theil is definitely trying to misdirect in some ways. He does bring up some interesting, like, okay, well, let's look at this element here. I thought it was disappointing for him to say that basically the child abuse was being overplayed, when I don't know if we have even got to the bottom of it yet. And Joe Rogan says that. He's like, what do you mean? We still don't know the truth. We still don't have the answers. But I encourage people to keep their eye on Peter Thiel, because as we've been reporting the last couple weeks, he's influencing the 2024 election. And on the other side, you got Eric Schmidt with the Bilderberg Group. Both men are powerful, and we should be watching them.
Well, we were watching out for that clip and anything that you write up on this over at theconsciousresistance.com or over at thelastamericanvagabond.com. Derek, a pleasure as always. Hey, everybody, Jason Bermas here. And if you enjoyed that segment, I want to let you know that I am live 5 days a week over at TNT.news. And if you go there, you can also interact in the chat. It is 3 to 5 Eastern time. We are global, baby. So again, if you dug that segment, please come check me out every Monday through Friday at TNT.news.